Well, here we are on Friday. We were supposed to start talking about chapter 11 on Wednesday. And I'm still in chapter 10. And it's like, why am I doing this? And and there's a whole bunch of stuff in chapter 10 I'm not going to talk about. One thing I would like to talk about that I'm not going to talk about is the section in the end of the section on old people. If you have any old people in your life, you need to read that section so you can better understand those old people. But if there's not time to talk about everything, it seems to me like that we ought to talk about the stuff that from psychology that can be most useful to you. And that's why, now for the people online, this handout I'm giving them is just a copy of page 401 in the textbook. But the reason I'm giving them a copy of this is because if you live on campus or if you spend much time here, okay, do any of you have a roommate or you live in a dorm? How many live in a dorm? You eat in the cafeteria? About half of you. Okay, the rest of you live at home. You drive back and forth. So I don't know which is tougher. Being a young adult, going to college, and living in school-provided housing and eating in a cafeteria, or living with your parents who keep forgetting that you're a young adult. You know what I'm talking about? It's kind of tough making those two work. So I copied page 401 from the textbook so you could take it with you and use it as a reference. So whether it's in the dormitory, in the cafeteria, at home with parents or siblings, whatever's going on, this page is all about resolving conflicts. Do we all have conflicts? We encounter them all the time. So what's the first thing to do when you want to resolve a conflict? What's the first thing on this handout on page 401?
Carefully choose the time and place for an argument.
Do we sometimes engage in arguments and it's not the best time and it's not the best place to have it?
Yeah.
So say, this is not the time or the place for that. Let's pick another time, another place to have this argument. I'm willing to have the argument if you want to have it, but let's do it in another time and another place. Although the other option would be, I just choose not to argue. Now, I kind of enjoy debating a topic or something. Okay, maybe I should even say I probably enjoy arguing a little bit. But somewhere, have any of you ever heard this? Somewhere I read this. It said, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Have any of you ever heard that? Well, when I first encountered that phrase and started thinking about it, I thought, Tom, you know what that really means? You could sit down with a person and engage in a conversation, and you could outthink them and win the argument, but you didn't really accomplish anything because you didn't change their thinking. They still think the same way they did before. They just don't like you anymore. So I concluded, maybe I just need to quit arguing with people so much since it doesn't accomplish that much. But I feel good about winning the argument. Okay, so go ahead and feed your ego, but recognize you're not going to change the world unless they're open and willing to change. In fact, this is what's fun about studying psychology. Once you start to study psychology, you'll discover that if you're more winsome, and if people start to like you, you're more apt to change the way they think about things rather than arguing with them. Okay, what's the second thing?
Be a good listener.
Here's a good reminder. You have how many mouths? 1. How many ears?
2.
2. So do the math. Listen twice as much as you talk. It seems like there's something happening in our world today that it's a part of the culture that you're growing up in. And that we don't really take much time to listen to each other. We just take turns talking at each other. While you're talking, I'm thinking of what I'm going to say next. And while I'm talking, you're thinking of what you're going to say next. Because we all want to be heard. And I kind of think television has done some of that to us. But just be aware of that. You want to resolve conflicts? Just listen to what people have to say. And then don't argue with them about it. Say, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And then start to even be a little empathetic. Oh, that's too bad. Number 3, what's the third thing to do?
Give feedback regarding your understanding of the other person's grievance.
I don't know why this guy doesn't trust me. What have I done to him? Now, see how it's like, I'm a trustworthy person. Ask a whole bunch of my friends. Why doesn't this guy want to trust me? Now, if I'm going to embrace this principle, what am I going to do? I'm going to say, what is it I've done that makes you not trust me? And then I listen to what he has to say. And I find out that as he's telling me why he doesn't trust me, he's trusted people in the past, and they've done him wrong. And I sound a lot like those people. Okay, watch. I'm a teacher in the classroom. He's trusted teachers in the past, and they violated his trust, and he'll never forget that. So if you're a teacher, he doesn't trust you. You see, it isn't me. He's had some past experience. And once he shares that experience with me, and I go, oh, that is so sad that a teacher would do that to you. Yeah, that's what I say. And that's why sometimes I say, send those teachers an email that didn't help you learn math and say, hey, why didn't you do your job? But before you send the email, stop and ask yourself this question. Was it that this teacher wasn't trying to help me learn math, or that I didn't care about it and I wasn't listening? Or was it a little bit of both? You follow what you do? You kind of start to analyze the situation. But give feedback. Let people know that you're a little sympathetic. Be candid. Be honest. Level with your partner, level with your friend about your feelings. You know how I feel about this waiting till the last minute to leave to go someplace. I say to my wife, I always want to be early. And she can say, you know how I feel about getting someplace early? I want to be there right on time. You follow? We just express our feelings to each other, and you're candid with how you feel about things, but I'm going to listen to her feelings twice as much as I'm going to tell her how I feel about it. Use I rather than you. You make me so nervous, waiting till the last minute to leave to go places. No. How would I say that using I instead of you? I get so uptight when we wait till the last minute to leave. Just talk about what it does to me. So, what's my solution? I mean, I've been married a long time and we have a happy marriage, so how have I resolved this? I haven't resolved it. I've learned to deal with it. And what do? Okay, we get ready to go someplace. Church starts at 9:30. So when should we leave to get there if we're 5 minutes away? 9:25? Dude, you guys just drive me crazy. See, that just scares me to do that. See, I just can't wait that long. At least 9:15, and preferably about 10 after 9. What for? So I can pick the seat where I want to sit, so I can get my favorite seat before anybody else takes it away from me. I just like to do it that way. See, use I stuff, express your feelings. And then, so my solution is that I get up, I go out to the car, and I sit there working a little Sudoku puzzle, wait until my wife comes out and gets in the car to leave. And if I go out at 10 minutes after 9, then she'll probably be out there at about 15 minutes after or 20 after. And we'll get there about 5 minutes early, and that'll work. But in the meantime, I've got a little puzzle to work on. And while I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I wish she would hurry, here she comes, wandering out the door, looking around at the weather, has a bag of trash in her hand. I mean, if you're on your way outside, you might as well throw the trash away while you're going to the car to get to church. And you know, oh, and I've got something else in my hand to put in the garage. You understand? Just save some time. Do 2 or 3 things at once. Ah! Well, I see her point. It makes sense to her. It just doesn't work for me. Number 6, focus on behavior, not on the person. Okay, you are always late. That's the behavior. You're just not a very self-disciplined person. See, don't, okay, our society, in other cultures, are you ready for this? In other cultures, if you go around insulting people's character like we do in America, you know, accusing them of being dishonest, of being immoral, of being greedy, you can be sued for slander in other cultures because you're attacking their personhood, their personality. And we do that all the time in this country, don't we? And what you need to do is say, no, I don't know that person well enough to make those judgments about them. All I can do is talk about what I see them doing. You children need to pay attention in Sunday school class when I'm talking to you. Well, reach in your pocket, pull out some attention and pay me. No. What is it I want them to do? When I'm talking, I want you to be listening, not talking, or not writing or doing something. And so you explain the behavior. It's how do you want these children to behave? These kids are a bunch of little brats. I mean, don't say that about children. You don't know them that well. Well, oh, see, and here's what I'll say. If you say that to me, I'll say, so what are they doing that makes you call them brats? And then you tell me what they're doing. I say, so let's talk about their behavior. You follow me? Rather than talk about them being little brats, whatever that means. Like, a brat is close to a brat. Is that like they're little hot dogs? Oh. Okay, number 7, don't overstate the frequency of a problem. Oh, I don't know how many times my daughter said this. Dad, you never let me. Why do you girls say that to your fathers? You never let me do this. You never let me do anything that I want to do. Why do we do that? It doesn't help to say, well, maybe if I make him feel bad, he'll give in and give me what I want. Well, don't do that. That's not going to resolve the conflict. That's just going to escalate it. Don't overstate the frequency of the problem. Every time I ask you if I can go shopping, you say no. Every time? What about this time? And I took you shopping, and this time? Oh, well, okay, not every time. Okay, see, don't overstate. Don't overstate. But sometimes when we're frustrated about something, we overstate the case. Number 8, focus on a limited number of specific issues. May I even change that one a little bit? Focus on one issue at a time. Don't talk about a whole bunch of things. Talk about one issue at a time. Oh, number 9, and anytime somebody's a little critical of you, don't find scapegoats for every grievance against you. Well, I did that because, and well, that happens because. Don't always try to excuse what you're doing. Say, I need to work on that. Can you help me? In fact, I think this is a great way to handle this. If with a roommate, I'm thinking of my roommate, who's my wife, and say, you know, Nina, I know that what I'm doing here really grieves you. It bothers you. So how about this? Go ahead and talk to me about it to remind me that it bothers you. Tell me how it makes you feel when I do that, but also pray for me. Ask God to change my life. One time when my daughters were teenagers and they were talking to me about how other their friends' parents let them do things that I never let them do, and I was such a terrible dad and so controlling and restricting. And I said, you know, girls, I probably am too protective of you because you're a precious gift from God. He said, but if I'm being so protective that I'm interfering with God's will for your lives, then I authorize you to ask God to take me out of this scene and give you a new father. Just give me a stroke, take me to heaven, and send a new father to live at his house and do a better job of what I'm doing. Now, when I told them they could do that, when I had left the room and we went our separate ways, I said, Lord, if I really need to make some changes, I would like to stick around and watch these girls grow up. So please work in my life to make me more accepting of letting them giving them more freedoms to do some things. And then I'd say, and please help them understand that I'm thinking about their well-being. You follow? I start talking to God about the relationship. And when we had that conversation, one of them got a tear in her eye. And she goes, Dad, you're not that bad that I would ask God to replace you and give us a new father. Well, that's a comforting thought. But you can pray that God will change my mind. Can't you? And I authorize them to do that. So simply, suggest ways that we can address this problem. It's number 10. Number 11, be open to compromise. Be open to make some adjustments. And number 12, don't think in terms of winners and losers. Hopefully, we're all winning at this situation. We're all going to come out at the end of life, stepping into heaven and hearing God say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And we want God's best for our children, and our children want God's best for their parents. But sometimes, is this fair to say this? Sometimes in the mix of all this stuff, selfishness just prevails so much. I mean, isn't that what's going on in the world we live in? People are just being so selfish. I mean, the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do you see a lot of people? I mean, when I was working with high school kids as a high school teacher, and I said to them, when I see you doing things to other people that seem to be inappropriate, that I say to you, would you want someone doing that to you? And what's the answer? No. Would you want someone talking mean to you? No. But I said, well, yeah, but they did this. I said, no, just ask yourself. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. And the more you focus on that, the better you're going to resolve conflicts and have good relationships. And what is the driving force behind all this conflict? Isn't it just sin and selfishness? Because the bottom line is, we could just be willing to do it the other person's way. I'll just get adjusted to being late to church once in a while because she wants to get there right on time. But I will remind her when we get there and her favorite place to sit is taken by somebody else, I'll say, I'll bet that seat was available 5 minutes ago. And what's happened over time is she's been willing to get places a little earlier, and I've been willing to get places a little later. We've compromised on it. I like to go out and eat. And she doesn't. She just doesn't care to eat in restaurants. So we're going someplace on the road, and I say, let's stop up here at Cracker Barrel and get something to eat. No, let's just go to Wendy's and go through the drive-thru or Taco Bell and get something and eat it in the car. Oh, what if I go to Cracker Barrel and order a carry-out meal and then we eat that in the car? Oh, we could do that. So, see, you just look for compromise. Okay, now we're up to chapter 11, where we're supposed to be, where it's all about personality. Do you know anything about your personality? Oh yeah, you told me on Wednesday that you've taken some personality tests. And you can go on the internet and find a whole bunch of them. But on page 418, the textbook gives a definition of personality. It's an individual's unique pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that persist over time. Okay, from the conversation we just had, resolving conflicts, what's one of my behaviors that persist over time in terms of traveling and going someplace? I always want to arrive early. Mm-hmm. Always. That's just the way I'm wired. That's my personality. And my wife still can't figure out why I feel the need to get places so early. And I can't completely figure out why she is willing to arrive at the last minute. She just feels good about that. That's her personality. So those are behaviors that persist over time. What are some feelings? If we have a disagreement, we ought to talk about it. That's the way I feel about things. You know, frankly, she says, rather than argue, I would just soon say, live and let live. What? And so then I start using Bible verses. No, the Bible says the two become one. And so it's like, oh, so what, Tom? I'm supposed to become like you? Or does that mean you become like me? Oh. It could be, what the Bible's talking about, is I lose some of my individuality to become more like her, and she loses some of hers to become a little more like me, and that's this beautiful thing called marriage. Do any of you know some old people in church that they've been married so long and lived together so long and they've been friends for so long that they act and talk and sound a lot alike? I used to sit behind those people in church and try to spend time visiting with them after church to ask them what were their secrets to being so much like each other in old age. Were they always like that? And they laugh and say, oh no. And so I said, so tell me how you got to this place, because when I'm as old as you are, I would like to be in that place too. That just looks like a good place to be. And I would ask them to talk to me about how they felt about it and what they think about things. I still remember when I met my wife here at Calvary, when we were students together. We got married, and I was a pastor's major. I graduated. I went to work in a Christian school as a Bible and math teacher. Went back to school to get my credential as a certified math teacher, and had forgotten how much fun math was. Came home from a class that I think it was Calculus 2, must have been Calculus 2, and I said, Nina, I'd forgotten how much fun this stuff is. And I start sharing some of this calculus with her, and she goes, Tom, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I don't even care. Oh, how could an intelligent, she made better grades than I did in school, how could an intelligent, beautiful person not care about math? Now, do you understand how important that was for me to come to that realization as a math teacher in a Christian high school? What was I going to assume? That all these wonderful Christians are just going to love math? Not. And I had this great friend who didn't love math, didn't even care about it, but she was a lovely person. So all of a sudden, I had to make an adjustment in my thinking. There are a lot of lovely, wonderful people out there who don't care about math. So don't be judgmental about them. Just help them learn enough math to get along in life. Adjust your thinking about some things. Okay, so there you are. Do you know yourself very well? Have you stopped to do some reflecting? That's why I have you write this paper on your pilgrimage to wholeness, to talk about something as to how you got to the place where you think like you do, where you feel like you do, where you behave like you do. What are the things that have contributed to your becoming the person that you are today? Now, when it comes to personality, this book devotes several pages to psychodynamic theories, which started with Sigmund Freud. Have any of you heard of James Dobson? He's written some books. Okay, have you ever heard him talk in his books about his little dachshund, his little pet dog named Siggy? There was a purpose for him doing that. Because Sigmund Freud had some real problems in his own personal life and thinking. But his thinking caught on to the point to where it's very prevalent in America. And probably part of what makes it popular in America is his thinking, and the textbook does a good job of representing this, where he seemed to, I guess what I should say it this way, that he seemed to think that all the driving forces in our life were sexual forces. And Carl Jung, the second one you talk about in the textbook on page 424 and 425, he said, no, id is all of the life's forces, not just sexual drives, not just sexual forces. And I think one of the reasons that psychodynamic theories are so popular is because we live in a society where everything is sexualized. Sexy toothpaste, sexy cars, sexy pocket knives, sexy fountain pens, sexy tablets, sexy telephones. You know, give me a break. Everything's got some kind of sex appeal. Even driving down the highway, I used to see a billboard, and here's this lady in a black velvet dress reclining on a couch and looking out with this big smile on her face, and I'm going, what are they selling? And she was holding a bottle of black velvet. You know what that is? Whiskey. An alcoholic beverage. Alcoholic beverages have sex appeal? No, they just keep attaching everything to it. And because so much of our society has focused on that for so long, I mean, Hollywood makes a lot of money promoting sexuality and entertains people as if life revolves around sexual activity. And it's just not true. But I think that's part of why psychodynamic theory is so popular. But there's another aspect to psychodynamic theory that they present on page 418 that's worth looking at. And here's what it says. The following 5 propositions are central to all psychodynamic theories. So even if a modern psychodynamic theorist feels like Freud missed the boat, here are still 5 things that they embrace. And the first one is much of life is the result of unconscious motivators in our lives. That much of our behavior, we do it without thinking about it, without being conscious of what's going on. Would you agree with that? that we often do things without being conscious of what motivated us to do it. So, see that first premise, you say, hey, there's some truth there. So if a theory has some tenets that pretty much reflect small t truth in the world we live in, then they're going to be more acceptable to people. In other words, if a theory has enough small t truth wrapped up in it, often people will embrace the whole theory, and rather than be discerning about it and take the part that is only compatible with small t truth. 2, mental processes lead to conflicting feelings. Do all of us have conflicting feelings? So that's another small t truth. Conflict is just part of what goes on. You get up, you hear it's going to be cold outside, so you say what? I'll put on a sweater. You step outside and it's hot, you go, whoa, I'm going to go back and put the sweater back. No, I don't want to go back. I don't want to go that trouble. I'll just keep it on. If I have to, I'll take it off and carry it. Yeah, but then I might leave it somewhere. You understand? We've all got all this conflicting stuff going on, and most of us don't stop to think about what's going on inside of our heads. Well, when we looked at Gardner's 8 kinds of intelligence, one of those was people who are really good at that introspection stuff, and the rest of us maybe aren't very good at it at all. But all of us, the more we learn to do that, the more we get a better handle on what's going on in our lives and why things are happening. The third one is experiences, early childhood experiences strongly affect personality development. Now, here's a question I have to ask. If you're raised in a real bad environment as a child, is that going to wreck the rest of your life, or can your life come together later in spite of early childhood experiences? In other words, are you destined to be a certain way because of early childhood experiences, or can you grow beyond those childhood experiences? And the answer would be,
you can grow beyond.
We can grow beyond them. We're not bound by those. Now, they do strongly affect us, but they don't necessarily solidify and turn us into concrete. So that one's partially true. Number 4, our mental representations of ourselves, others, and relationships guide how we interact with people. My mental representations. For example, in this class, when we were doing Gardner's intelligence thing, and I asked you to add to the list, when I say, okay, share some stuff with me. When I ask you guys to share things, I'll bet if we were all sitting in the cafeteria eating lunch, and I ask you the same question, you would be quick. You would respond quicker, and you would be more open to share things in a cafeteria setting than you are in a classroom setting. Is that a fair thing to say that? If we were just sitting in the cafeteria or sitting over in a snack shop or something and talking, and I ask you a question, you'd be more open to share what you thought than you are when I stand up here as a teacher and ask a question. Does anyone know why there's that reluctance to answer a question in class? Sometimes that's why I walk around to get from behind there, because just the dynamics of standing behind a podium can have a dampening effect on people sharing things. So part of it is just the classroom setting. But a big part of your unwillingness to share is past experiences in the classroom. Do any of you ever remember being asked a question in class and sharing your answer and being embarrassed for not giving the answer the teacher wanted? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Whoa! Would that cause you to be a little hesitant to ask questions? I still remember in grad school, I mean, when you're working on a PhD, the professors kind of treat you like peers. And this one professor, he said, hey, he said, let's talk about this test I just gave. Tell me what you think about it. And I sat there and I thought, oh boy, let's see what happens. And some ladies in the class, because it's an education program, so I had mostly women in the class, some ladies in the class spoke up and told him what they thought of his test. And he just went ballistic and exploded and started saying, well, what do you know about putting a test together? Have you taken this course? And I thought, oh man. And during the break, some of the women said, well, he asked me to tell him what I thought about it. And I smiled and I said, you've never had anyone do that to you before? Is this well, yes, but I thought here in grad school it'd be different. I'm going, life is pretty much the same everywhere. So I'm just like you. If I'm sitting where you are and someone's asking a question, I'm going to be reluctant to share what I'm thinking, because it might be that they're asking me to be a mind reader and to tell them what they're thinking. So just understand that our interactions with people are basically regulated by our mental representations of ourselves, of others, and of relationships. And then the fifth one on page 419, the development of personality involves learning to regulate, now see, here's psychodynamic theory, sexual and aggressive feelings, but mostly sexual feelings, as well as becoming socially independent rather than dependent. But is the development, is part of my growing up to be a whole person, learning to regulate my feelings, learning to get a handle on how I feel about things? So there's some truth there. It's just that it's not just about sexual things. It's not just all about sex and violence. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because what are the two things they put in movies to get people to pay money to come and watch them? Sex and violence. So it shows you how psychodynamic thinking has become quite prevalent in the society that we live in. Oh, and on page 419, look at that picture at the bottom of the page. Does everybody know, have you studied or read about Freud enough to know what that big old iceberg is supposed to represent? That the little white peak at the top, you know, a real iceberg, most of it's underwater, and there's a little bit sticking out. So the idea here is that to Freud, what you're aware of is just a tiny bit of the whole big iceberg. And the more I look at that and the more I study it and the more I look at Scripture and see what it says about us, there's no question that all of us have things going on. What did Paul say? The things I would, I do not. The things I would not do, I do. Oh, wretched man that I am, who's going to deliver me from this? And so actually, I read an article written by a man who teaches at a Christian college who talks about that's the rationale for this picture on page 419 for all this unconscious stuff. And I'm saying, you know, I'm not sure that the unconscious part is all that big. You know what I'm talking about? There's no question that there's some unconscious stuff there. I'm just not sure it's all unconscious, or 90% of it, or 80% of it's unconscious. I think we're probably more aware of what's going on. But, are you ready for this? If I confront somebody with doing something wrong, okay, a friend of mine that I worked with when I was a student here in school went to another school here in town where they embraced a different brand of theology. What's your definition of sin?
Missing the mark.
Missing the mark. Guess what his definition of sin was? A willful transgression of a known law of God. So, when we were working together and he was on the phone talking to someone, he told him he couldn't meet with him that night, and he lied because he didn't want to tell him what he was really doing. He didn't think it sounded legitimate enough. So when he hung up, I'll call him Roy, and I said, Roy, did I just hear you tell a lie to one of your customers? And he goes, well, he said, I didn't want to tell him the real reason that I wasn't going to meet with him. I said, but doesn't the Bible say thou shalt not lie? Isn't lying a sin? And here's what he said. Well, I didn't do it consciously. It came out of my unconscious. I didn't deliberately think about it. And I'm going, what does it have to do with it? And that's when he said, because for it to be sin, it has to be a willful transgression of a known law of God. Now, if you don't know the Ten Commandments and you break them, do you still suffer the consequences of breaking the Ten Commandments? Mm-hmm. Yes. So I realized then that there are some people in this world who, and there's no doubt in my mind that Roy's going to heaven when he dies, but he's got a messed up definition of sin. And I sometimes think that some of those definitions grow out of psychodynamic theory. The idea that we don't want to be accountable for what we don't know. And in fact, if that were the case, are you better off to read the Bible through every year or just not know what God wants you to do? You follow the rationale? That's pretty scary stuff. So let's not let this picture stick in our heads. If you're going to put that picture in your head, could you draw a line at least across the middle and say there's surely not more than half of it that's underwater and the other half is above water? And I'm not sure where the percentages ought to be, but the picture definitely in my opinion, the picture definitely misrepresents reality. Oh, and that gives me something here. That brings me to the place where I have a handout for you. I'm tempted to give you the handout that I found written by the Christian professor from a Christian liberal arts college, but every time I look at it and I think that would be good to give them that handout, but the reason I don't give it to you is because, have you ever heard anybody using the Bible to proof text something? Where they're trying to prove a point, so they pull verses out of context and use them to prove their point? Well, this guy does some of that. So I thought, well then don't put bad hermeneutics in front of students as if it's a justification for why some people, even Christians, embrace psychodynamic theories. I think the better reason for it is because there's enough small t truth in psychodynamic theory to suck some people into that kind of thinking, because it has a certain amount of truth in it. That's why it became popular. You just have to sort out where the error is in it, but that's true of every theory. You take from the theory what's useful and good and discard the stuff that's erroneous and wrong. And the other thing from Freud's theory, because I'm not necessarily going to talk about this, I don't think I need to, it just shows you that there are scholarly people who aren't Christians who say, this psychodynamic theory leaves something to be desired. But I'm not here just to throw stones at every theory we look at. I'm saying, what do they talk about that can be useful to me? And when they talk about the id, this place where you have all these desires, I'm thinking, well, Freud called it the id, but that kind of sounds like the flesh to me. And my fleshly desires, and when it talks about the ego, the thought processes that mediate between the id and the superego, the superego being my moral guardian, that would be like my conscience. You follow what I'm doing? I'm trying to think of where this stuff fits into real life. And then my ego would be the thought processes I use to mediate. That would be where I make a decision to either behave in a way that's consistent with my conscience and my moral upbringing, or behave in a way that's consistent with how I feel about it. And sometimes I go one way and sometimes I go the other. And then if you make the wrong choice, what's the word we use for that in Christian circles? You start feeling convicted. And then you realize, oh, what I just did was sin. Oh, no. I don't get to go to heaven now that I've sinned. No. You go to heaven because you've become a child of God through trusting Christ as your Savior. And what do we do when we sin? 1 John 1:9. Do all of you have that one memorized? If we confess our sin, He's faithful and just to forgive us and then do what? Cleanse us from all unrighteousness. God is such a gracious, caring God. And what's it mean to confess your sin? This is another area where sometimes I have a discussion or even a debate with some of my friends where, okay, so what? I offended you. I said something that offended you. So I'm wrong. I think about it, someone brings it to my attention, and I realize that was wrong. That was sin. So confess it to God. So what do I say? God, what I did was sin. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't do the right thing, and I confess it as sin. I just simply say it's sin along with you because you say it's sin. So now how do I restore the relationship with the person? I go to them and I say, what I did was wrong, and I want to say I'm sorry and I apologize for that. And some of my friends will say, well, no, you need to ask them to forgive you. No, I don't. The Bible says, confess your faults to one another. Doesn't it? I confess my fault to that person. I don't have to put the burden on them to forgive me. God has forgiven me when I confess the sin. I just need to confess my shortcoming. And sometimes I think that some of this, no, ask them to forgive you. You know, it's like, and if they don't forgive you, then there's nothing you can do about it. I said, no, see, to me, that looks like page 421. That starts to sound like one of these defense mechanisms. So be careful about some of that. And look at those defense mechanisms. We'll deny it ever happened. We'll repress it. We project it onto others. There's a whole bunch of things that people do that are called defense mechanisms. And I'm thinking sometimes it could be that I'm not going to ask them to forgive me. I'm going to confess my shortcomings. And generally when I say to my wife, I was wrong when I did that, Nina, and I apologize. I am truly sorry. Now, what will she often say to me? I forgive you, Tom. You understand? She'll just say that to lighten my burden, because the Bible talks about bearing one another's burdens. But I don't need to ask her to do that. Let her do that on her own. And if she's not ready to forgive me yet because I hurt her so deeply, then I'm just going to have to live with that for a while until she comes around. And while I'm waiting, I'm probably thinking about how I didn't mean to hurt her that much. I need to be more careful about the things I say and do. There you go. There you go. Now you've got your ego under control. Be more careful about what you say and do. Page 424 talks about Carl Jung. Oh, and I mentioned already where he says here in the middle of page 424 that even though he studied under Freud and agreed with Freud in a lot of areas, he thought that he saw the unconscious as the ego's source of strength and vitality in every area of life, not just in the sexual area. It represents all of life forces. And when you talk about like somebody has a sexual predator is driven by some sexual motivation. An athlete is driven by what? Achievement, motivation, a desire to be at the top of his game. So it's like all these life forces. A person who strives to make straight A's is driven by some kind of life force inside. A person who wants to, above all else, be honest in all of their dealings, it's just like you could take, it's almost like all of your motivations for doing what you do become part of that sum total of the life forces within you. And there's a whole, when you look at, well, I'll just give you another handout here that has to do with, to show you how influential Jung has been. Here's personality types explained according to good old Carl. Extrovert, introvert, sensing, intuition. We pretty much know what extrovert, and introvert are, don't we? Mm-hmm. Well, what about the second one? Sensing and intuition. Now, see, the textbook on page 425 calls what this handout calls sensing and intuition, it calls it rational and irrational. That's kind of like the three kinds of children. What were the three kinds of children? Easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. That difficult is kind of a negative connotation label. So which would you rather be? Considered a rational person or an irrational person? See, I'm thinking rational has positive kind of emotional sounds to it. Irrational tends to have negative, doesn't it? Or is it just me because I'm mathematical? Would you rather someone say you're a very rational person, or would you rather them say you're a very irrational person? Right. I mean, even when I say irrational, doesn't it kind of sound like it has a negative tone to it, as opposed to rational? So in the book on page 425, when it talks about rational and irrational, think of it as sensing, where you're using your senses, touch, taste, feel, smell, that kind of thing, as opposed to intuition. Sensing as opposed to intuition.
So sensing is rational and intuition is irrational?
That would be what the book is doing with it.
Okay.
And see, now watch this. Okay, have you ever heard of anyone talk about intuition?
Yeah.
What's the word they put in front of it?
Mother.
A mother's intuition? Have you heard that? Why don't you hear about a father's intuition?
Dads are busy.
Oh, they're too busy. And besides, they're too rational. Okay, you see what happens? See, ladies, I'm saying there ought to be a campaign on this. I'm wondering why the feminist movement hasn't picked up on this rational and irrational stuff and saying, wait a minute, it has to do with sensing and intuition. And is there something to be said for intuition? I just have a sense. Okay, when I was back teaching high school students, I still owned the suit that I graduated from high school with. It was, do anyone know anything about cloth, herringbone material? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, it was an old style pattern that was very popular in the 60s. And I still owned that suit because it would still fit me when I was a teacher in the 70s. And my wife said, you don't want to wear that to school. And I'm going, why not? It still fits me and it's a good suit. She goes, because the kids will laugh you out of the classroom. I'm saying, why would they do that? She said, I'm just telling you, Tom. I'm just telling you. I said, that doesn't make any sense. I drove off to school. I was only like 5 minutes away from school. I drove off to school, walked into my first hour class, and I stood up there and started teaching, and the whole class was laughing. It's like, what's so funny? And they go, your suit, Mr. Bodine, where did you get that? I'm going, I paid good money for this. They go, why would you do that? And it was like it was so out of style that they couldn't even listen to what I had to say. Oh, my wife's intuition was right. And I had a preparation period after that first hour class, so I went home and changed clothes and said, you know, Tom, whether it makes sense or not, you need to listen to your wife. And every now and then, when I'm going someplace to speak and there's some things I'm going to say that are pretty intense, I'll say, Nina, listen to this. Let me run this by you and tell me, what are people going to think about that? I mean, what's the reaction I'm going to get from people when I say that? And she said, well, I can just tell you this is the way some people are going to respond to that. I'm going, why would they do that? She goes, you asked me, Tom, I'm just telling you, you might want to find some other words. And so I've learned, you go back to the study, find some other words, other ways to frame it and present it so that you don't alienate people who are over there in the intuition area. So I have a respect for both sensing and intuition. You go, why is that? Well, let's see. If you would have been there when Jesus fed the 5,000 with that little boy's lunch, knowing who Jesus was and what he was capable of doing, what would intuition tell you? He can make this happen. What did their senses tell most of the disciples? This isn't enough to feed this many people. And Jesus has said, just have them sit down. We'll take this lunch and feed everybody. And he did. So, I see there's something to be said for, and in fact, where I would use what is sometimes called intuition, is I read the Bible and I don't completely understand it and it doesn't make sense to me, but I embrace it anyway because that's an area where I live by faith rather than by sight. The third criteria that we get from Carl is thinking and feeling. How do you process information? Well, this is what I think about it. And my wife says, well, this is how it makes me feel. So that's why she's a good helpmate, because she brings me back to the feeling side of things. And there was a time in my life when I actually thought, God intends for all of us to be thinkers and to do away with this feeling stuff. Then so I wrote a question. This is so fun to do this. I wrote a question on a piece of paper. Where does God talk about his feelings? And then I read through the Bible and started writing down references. Can you think of any references where God talks about his feelings? Do any of you know John 3:16? What does it say?
For God so loved the world.
Is he talking about his feelings? I was helping some teachers do some certification one time by going through an Old Testament survey. Have any of you taken an Old Testament survey yet? Okay, when you finish reading through the Old Testament, what's your conclusion about what God should rationally do with the human race?
I took that class freshman year.
Wipe them off the face of the earth and start all over the new Garden of Eden? See if the next crowd can do better? But that isn't the way a loving God operates. And by the way, that same loving God who has these feelings for us, does he hate anything?
He hates sin.
He hates sin. And when I told some junior high kids one time, I said, you realize that not only when you sin you get in trouble, but you also break God's heart. You offend the creator of the universe. And they hadn't thought about that before. And then the fourth criteria that comes from Carl is judging and perceiving. Judging simply means that you make judgments about things. You have rules you follow and you stick to your plans, that kind of thing. Perceiving means that you're inclined to improvise or explore alternative options. And we probably ought to learn to do a little bit of both. When you take these tests, so see, when you go on the internet to take a test, you'll probably notice, after we get through talking about this chapter today, you'll probably notice when you take a test, you say, oh, this test was built with Carl Jung's theory. Or you'll say, oh, this test was built with Cattell's theory. And we'll talk about that one before we get through with the chapter today. But mainly I want to talk about these, what I call the big topics. Psychodynamic theory, with its overemphasis on sexuality, and Jung's theory that talks about those 4 dimensions of personality. And again, is personality more than just those 4 dimensions? Or 5, or whatever it was we looked at there? Oh yeah, that handout on the back talks about all those different kinds. Yeah, those 4. Okay. Then Alfred Adler on page 425 talks about the part of our personality where we compensate for things, and talks about inferiority complexes. What's an inferiority complex? What is that? If you saw somebody with an inferiority complex, what would you see? What kind of behavior would be reflected by a person with an inferiority complex? What kind of words would people use who have an inferiority complex? Any ideas? Well, look at the bottom of page 425. Some people become so fixated on their feelings of inferiority that they become paralyzed and develop what Adler calls an inferiority complex. Feelings of inferiority. I'm not as good as so-and-so. I can't do that. That's probably the thing I hear most often that starts to move in that direction of feeling inferior. When I say to some little kid, hey, you want to do this? Or some little kid, I said, you want to ride a bicycle? And he says, I can't ride a bicycle. I said, no, what you mean is no one's ever taught you how to ride one. Would you like to learn to ride one? Now, the little kid might say, no, I'm afraid I'll fall and skin my knee. I said, well, that's a possibility. However, I have a bicycle that I've fixed so you won't fall off of it very easily when you're learning to ride. And he goes, really? I said, yeah, so the likelihood of skinning your knee is pretty small. You want to see the bicycle I fixed? He goes, yeah. And I had this little kid's bike, used to have it. It's gone now. My family made me haul them all away. But it was a little short bike for little kids, and I took the pedals off of it. Anyone remember learning to ride a bike where you got on the bike and you put your feet on the ground and push yourself along, but the pedals kept hitting your legs? I took the pedals off so they wouldn't hit their legs. So then they can just push it right along and scoot along and walk on it and move it and feel good about it. And then our driveway has a slope so they could ride down the driveway. And pretty soon they said, can you put the pedals back on here? I think I'd like to try to pedal this thing. I said, sure. And I'd pull the pedals out and screw them back on, and they would ride it with the pedals. But it's just like, see, often when people say, I can't do that, what I say is, you mean no one ever taught you how to do it. And not knowing how to do something is no big deal. But if you focus on, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, you start to develop that inferiority complex. And all of us, in areas where we have weaknesses, compensate. My daughters used to say, like we would have a discussion when they were teenagers, and it wasn't a pleasant discussion, and so we finally finished the discussion. And so I'd say, Girls, you know I love you. Yeah, and we love you too, Dad. And I'd give them a big hug. Okay? And I did that because that's what the textbook said to do. And then here's what I did to compensate. And I didn't even know I was doing this until my daughters brought it to my attention. I would say, so, you girls want to go shopping? What? Shopping. One of my pastimes as a father with 2 daughters was taking girls shopping, looking for bargains. And they would say, sure. And we'd get in it. I mean, are you girls the same as my daughters were years ago, or have times changed? That girls just like to go shopping whether they need something or not.
Yeah.
Especially if somebody else is going to spend the money and buy it for them if we can find a bargain. And I used it as an occasion to teach them to be responsible with money, that you just don't buy anything at any price. You look for bargains. I mean, we go to Kohl's, we look for stuff that's 10 cents on the dollar. That's the stuff that's marked 90% off or 80% off. I don't buy it when it's half price. I wait till it goes to 80% off. And they go, Dad, all the good stuff will be gone by then. No, it won't. You wait. We'll come back when they mark it down some more. There'll be one here. Somebody will have bought one and they brought it back and they'll put it back on a rack and mark it down to 90% off. You know what 90% off means? It means a $35 dress costs $3.50. And you can find that stuff at Kohl's. Okay, enough of that. So I compensated for helping them grow up by taking them shopping. And we all compensate for stuff. And all of us at times feel inferior. So that's why Adler's theory is so popular. Karen Horney on page 426 talked about anxiety. And didn't I give you a handout on this anxiety stuff? Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Be anxious for nothing. How to deal with anxiety using scripture, Philippians 4, 6, and 7. So that's why she's in the book, because she hit on a topic that's very important. And then neurotic trends that help people deal with emotional problems and feel safe. They either become submissive, aggressive, or detached. Let's see. You know what submissive means, don't you? That just means you do what everybody says you to do. You just follow the crowd. What's aggressive mean? That you argue with everybody and you resist any kind of influence from other people. What's detachment mean? Means you go off in the woods and live by yourself, where there are no people around. Erickson, why is he so popular? Well, the table on page 429, I got that one too. Because I did something with this table that I think is very helpful. I mean, all of these theories have people who criticize them for what some people would call the misuse of the theory. But they're theories, so don't be afraid to look at the theory and say, what can I get from this theory that's useful? And for the people online, this handout, I don't know if you can see it or not, but all I did was just, I looked this over and I said, you know what makes this, what makes this, what I like about Erickson is the positive stuff. And somebody who knows me well would say, that figures, Tom, because that's the way you are. You're always looking at the positive side of life, no matter what happens. I mean, I get in my car and I'm headed home and I have a flat tire. And so I have to stop what I'm doing and change the tire. And then I hear a siren going by and I'm saying, whoa, praise the Lord for that flat tire. I could have been in a car wreck up the road there if I hadn't had that flat tire that stopped me from doing it. I just see life from a very positive perspective. It's just part of my personality. So it's not surprising what I've done with this Erickson's 8 stages of life is I've just circled the positive parts. Now, again, some of the criticisms of Erickson have to do with these ages over here, But let's just look down at the things I've circled on this handout. Okay, have you learned to trust people? Have you ever seen a little kid stand on a couch and say, "Catch me," and then jump? Have you ever seen somebody stand there at the couch and say, "Hey, little boy, jump and I'll catch you"? And then when he jumps, they back away and say, "Ha ha ha, fooled you, didn't I?" Whoa! Can you see where if you have enough bad experience as a child, you don't trust people? And if that's happened to you, then it's time to start working on this trust thing and turn it around where you become more of a trusting person. And it probably starts out with trusting God, and then trusting a few close friends, so that you develop. In other words, Erickson calls them stages of life. I would call them maybe functions in life or aspects of life that all of us need to develop. And that is trust. I mean, I call my wife and say, "Well, I'm headed home. You want me to stop at the store and get anything?" And she'll say yes. So what if my wife said, "You know, Tom, no, I don't want you to stop and get anything. I think I want to do my own shopping this week. Can I have the credit card, just go to the store and buy whatever I think we ought to have?" What's my answer? What should my answer be?
Yeah.
Yes. Why would I not be willing to do that? I don't trust her. You follow? If you're going to trust people, you have to work at learning to be trusting and learning to be trustworthy. One time, my wife gave me a list of stuff to buy, and I got home and I forgot to buy one of the things on the list. And she goes, "Oh no, and I really needed that." And I thought, "You're not being trustworthy, Tom." I said, "Well, I don't know why I forgot it, but it's no big deal. I'll just go back to the store and get it." She said, "No, don't go to the trouble." I said, "No, I want to go to the trouble." Why would I want to go to the trouble to do that? Because I want to become trustworthy. So pick these things out. Autonomous. What's autonomous? It means if everybody else is doing the wrong thing, I'm going to do the right thing and I'm going to walk away from it. I'm just going to leave. When I was a teacher, I did not eat lunch in the teacher's lunchroom because I went in there the first time I went in the teacher's lunchroom at a school where I was working, and all they were doing was just talking bad about students. And I thought, this is a bad environment. I don't like this. So I said, I think I'll just eat now if I ate in my room, they would think I'm not social. So I would go eat in the cafeteria and hang out with the students. And that was my reason for being there, so I could hang out with the students. Because I didn't want to tell them that their conversations were like noxious weeds. Develop some autonomy. Learn to stand alone when it comes time for that. Take some initiative. Now see, it says that's childhood 3 to 6. Well, if you didn't learn it when you were 3 to 6, figure it out. Learn to take some initiative. It is so cool to take some initiative to do something you've never done before. Just do it. Industry. Become an industrious person. I go to my grandson's baseball games. I pull out my little camera. I get there early, put my seat at a special place behind the backstop where the outside edge of the batter's box lines up with the rubber on the pitcher's mound. That's the perfect place to be to get the best videos. I sit there and videotape the whole game, whether my grandson's playing or not. You go, why? Because it's become a little industry with me. I got the camera in my lap because my grandson isn't playing, so I just sit there and watch the game. Something happens and I'm going, man, I wish I had that on tape. Wouldn't it be fun to email that little clip to the student who just did it? Hit a home run. Yeah, it would. Well, Tom, what you can do, if you sit there and tape the whole game, then you'll get those magic moments. You say, yeah, but you're going to tape a 2-hour game to get a 1-minute home run? Hey, when I email that to the student who hit the home run, I get emails from his parents that go, whoa, how cool is this? I've got a little industry going. And everybody knows. I come to the ball game, I sit up there. I even have a little poncho that I can clip to the fence if it starts raining. So just like out at the Royals, I'm running my camera underneath there. I don't get paid for it. I just do it because it's a fun thing for me to do and it benefits other people. I've got a little industry going. When one of our daughters was about 12 years old, I said, and she was kind of bemoaning the fact that she didn't make as good a grades as her sister did. And I said, don't worry about it. I said, you've got skills that your sister doesn't have. And she said, like what, Dad? I said, like you are the super cleaning lady at our house. I mean, I don't understand this, but our 12-year-old daughter, our second daughter, when she was 12 years old, she loved to scrub the bathroom and just make it sparkle. And I'm thinking, that's a gift right there. I mean, she could grow up and run a house cleaning business. But develop some industry. Identity, develop a sense of who you are. And yes, you're unique because God made you that way. Intimacy, that's where you start to develop some relationships with other people. And see, the psychoanalyst would say, intimacy, that's when you start being sexual with someone. No, there's all kinds of intimacy that we ought to be thinking about. And that's just simply developing relationships with other people, connecting with others. Now we know who we are. Let's connect with other people and get to know others and avoid the loneliness and being incomplete and feeling isolated. See, that's the negative side. If you don't do these positive things, you end up living over here on the negative side of the railroad tracks. And then generativity versus stagnation, that's for people from 40 to 65. That's for middle-aged people who've just been doing the same thing so long it just becomes routine. And it's like you need to find some way to generate something, to do something that's satisfying, to make a difference in people's lives. Or you'll just start to stagnate. And then when you get old, and by the way, if you know old people who have done these things listed here, these 7 things, when they get old, there's a great sense of satisfaction. Erickson called it integrity. There's a great sense of satisfaction, as opposed to despair or a lot of regrets about life. Well, I said I was going to finish this. It didn't look like I did I? All right, so if we're not finished there, we'll talk about Carl Rogers on Monday. We'll get this done in 2 weeks, no matter what.